There are plenty of theories out there in the psychedelic community about the entities that we encounter within the experience, if they are real, what their origin is, and what they can do, also what their intention is towards us as visitors. Now, I've certainly got my own opinion on all of this, which I've covered in previous videos, but I recently saw a post online from Julian, who most people know as a person who invented and popularised the smokable form of DMT called Changa. And I've talked about that with him in a previous video, which I'll link to up there somewhere. Now, Julian is an accomplished psychonaut and facilitator, and he's one of the main spokespersons for psychedelics in his native Australia, which has led to being featured in many articles and TV shows. In this video, Julian and I do a deep dive into this topic of entities, and as you'll hear, we have some different opinions about what's going on, but it's a really great conversation, and I think there's a lot of value in hearing different perspectives from fellow travellers, especially ones as experienced as Julian. I thoroughly enjoyed having this chat with him, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. So without any further ado, I bring you Julian Palmer.
I know you've been fairly busy lately doing some TV appearances. How did that go?
Yeah, they edited a lot out. I've got the ABC also filming a cactus walk soon, right. So they're coming along. But they wanted to film an ayahuasca group. Both of them wanted to film an ayahuasca group, and I've already done that once. And I had a radio guy from ABC come along a couple of years ago, so I was like, no more of that. And it was just as well because I had a couple of people misbehave and one guy bite me on the arm.
Jesus. What kind of angle were they coming from? Was it kind of were they genuinely interested in the ayahuasca group, or was look at what these crazy nutcases are doing? In
Australia, they seem to be genuinely interested, you know. Cool. And I'm pretty much the only one crazy enough in the underground to say, "Hey, come and look at me. Come and see what I'm doing." All the rest of them are very hush-hush about it all. But they're really quite curious, and they're generally quite good journalists. So I have got a fair bit of media appearance. And so in Australia, we have a fairly good public understanding of psychedelics. There's lots of, you probably have.
I'm surprised.
That. Yeah.
I think my the outside perception of kind of Australia is that I think it's seen as a country that's quite strict and conservative on stuff like drugs. But is that not the case, or is it just that attitudes have changed? Or
no, Australia's a very complex, nuanced culture. Where you have people who have a public face. They might appear to be strict, but behind doors, they are very loose and casual. So that Australian culture is very like that. It's we do things by the book here, and that's our public face. But because the book is so difficult to accord to, because British colonialism was so strict, it was almost impossible to get anything done or do anything in that paradigm. And so you had the phenomena of the larrikin was born, and the larrikin is the one who broke all the rules in Australian culture. So even the Prime Minister called Australia's richest man, Kerry Packer, a gentleman and a larrikin.
I've never come across that word before.
And it's a compliment. So, and that would be the highest compliment to be given an Australian man. So it's wait on, so you're a gentleman and you're a hoodlum at the same time. So I'm trying. It's almost dead, the larrikin. So I'm trying to enact the one who's breaking the rules and trying to get things done. So you have some sort of respect within Australian culture if you're someone who's actually, getting things done, because colonialism, it's like scratching your ass is illegal in Australia. This it's very bureaucratic.
Well, I think that seems to be the sign of the times at the moment. There does seem to be a lot more tolerance and sort of interest in people who do that. I mean, not to go into crazy political tangents, but I think that was a lot of the kind of the attraction to some of these politicians like Donald Trump, or even people like Elon Musk. They're seen as the kind of the troublemakers who will get stuff done. Whether that's actually true or not is a different story. But I think that's the how they're perceived, and that's why the kind of people are gravitate towards. Maybe it's just because they're so bored of the kind of the current systems that you just need someone to shake things up a bit. So
it's a bit like that. So the media quite likes me. You know, I got some media love, and all my parents' friends see me on the TV, and they think it's cool and interesting. And so in Australia, there is that really straight mentality, but it is changing, and because people are seeing that, hey, psychedelics do work to treat PTSD and depression, and then you have all these people who are actually getting results and finding great value in the psychedelic state. So you have a little bit of a mini revolution in Australia with people, you know, microdosing mushrooms and taking psychedelics. But, you know, of course it's a little bit messy because it's so many new people coming into the space who might not know what they're doing. So at this point, I'm a little bit like trying to communicate at the same time as not trying to, you know, shoot the horse. Hey, we've got to be really careful because we don't really know what we're doing in the West related to psychedelics. You know, this is very new to us. And we should proceed with a great deal of caution and wariness. And you know, these are very powerful substances.
Yes, I think that's kind of a good segue into the kind of the reason we set up this conversation, because I think it's one thing to have kind of like psychedelics in the media, and I think, you know, the fact that even these things are being talked about is cool. But what we kind of really wanted to talk about today was some stuff that I think's pretty far out, I think, for even for people within the psychedelic community. And just to give a bit of background to the audience, we're sort of members of a few, you know, kind of the same kind of online communities. And you made a kind of a post on one of these Facebook groups, which I found really interesting because it was clearly something you had a lot of passion about. And I'll just try and briefly paraphrase it, and then we can sort of get into it and really unpack it. So again, just as a very simplification of it, the topic was around the kind of the infamous entities which are sort of reported as you know, people encounter within these sort of the psychedelic space. And I believe, or your belief, as I can understand it, is that you see that there's a lot of these that are, firstly, these are, for want of a better word, like real, external, etheric beings, some of which that have kind of like a malicious intent towards us as human beings. And it's this kind of influence that they're having as we kind of ingress into their realm that is given like an increase in things like trauma, abuse, like the general state of disconnect, spiritual disconnect in modern society. And I think the problem that you're seeing, which I think you just kind of touched on there, is that this is something that's being ignored, and that science and academia are like completely dismissing these claims. And that means that the people who are exploring the sort of psychedelic realms are often just completely unaware that these things exist, which kind of leaves them free to a kind of like usual suspects kind of scenario, like Kaiser Soze, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is to convince people that it doesn't exist. So it was quite a long post. I thought it was a fascinating take because it was very, very different to my own perspective. And I wanted to sort of have the opportunity to talk about this because, first of all, I enjoyed talking to you, and also just to challenge my own ideas, because I would say I probably am more on the skeptical side, and I lean more towards like a kind of psychological basis for these kind of phenomena rather than interdimensional. But I really want to, like I said, really want to like get into it and sort of pick your brains in like a good faith discussion. So just for the audience, this is not like a sort of debate or a gotcha.
No. Let's have a friendly talk around the Skype campfire.
Exactly, mate. Exactly. So I mean, first of all, is that like what I've just paraphrased, or is that like a fair description of what you think's going on? And feel free to just expand on it.
Yeah, thereabouts. I think it's very difficult to talk about this subject matter because most people in our society have no idea what you're talking about. And, you know, they say, what do you mean, Ghostbusters or something like that? People don't really know. And I think the dialogue is a little bit immature in the West. The dialogue in Australia is a lot more mature than it is in Europe. I think that's because we've had a lot of DMT in the country for a lot longer. So since the early 90s, there's been a fair amount. In the early 90s, if you're a sort of relatively conscious person and you wanted to get DMT, you could do it, whereas that only really happened in America and Europe in the late 90s or even sometime in the noughties. So in Australia, we've had much more of a dialogue related to the entities that people encounter when they're smoking DMT, for example. So I'd say what I hear when people talk about the machine elves, the interesting thing when I first started giving DMT to people in starting year 2000 was no one saw any machine elves, They were regularly seeing entities, but there was just this huge range and diversity, and a lot of it was just stuff that I'd never, stuff similar to the sort of things that I was seeing. There was just many different species of beings, and the people were generally experiencing them, like Rick Strassman said in the DMT Spirit Molecule book. They would say, well, yeah, these were real entities that I met, and so that was the common experience. So I think the dialogue in Australia is a bit less theoretical and a bit more practical. I filmed a docu-series a few years ago, and I tried to find someone who would say that entities don't exist. And I only really know one person, or found one person who could present that case, because pretty much everyone in Australia that I know is either, yep, well, they exist, of course they do, we all see them and see them together sometimes. Or there's other people who are like, well, a little bit sort of sitting on the fence, but very few people have this perspective. Definitely not, no way, that's just ridiculous, what are you talking about,
So what would you, just to kind of like unpack the Ghostbusters kind of, thing, like, so what is it that when you're talking about entities, like how would you describe them? Are we talking about psychological sort of archetypes? Are we talking about sort of interdimensional beings? Are we just talking about something we just don't know, but are we talking about something, say, natural, like in the way that, say, like South American shamanism talks around, like sort of the kind of plant spirits, so something still like kind of material? So how would you?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I facilitate ayahuasca as well. So for me, when we talk about plant spirits, that's something that most people report. They might not experience with ayahuasca visitations from entities or beings that as commonly as, say, smoke DMT, but people will very, very commonly communicate with the ayahuasca spirit or an Acacia spirit, and it won't just be, rambly nonsense. It will be stuff that people need to hear. It will be very cogent, incisive information that will help them with their awareness and their consciousness of themselves. So it related to how I would define the entities themselves. I use the word etheric to describe them, and the etheric level of existence seems to me to be one that has an affinity with the physical dimension. And I'd say in my limited cosmology that the realm beyond the etheric is the astral. And so beyond that, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but the etheric seems to have the ability to have a relationship with the physical. So a lot of the entities that you might meet in the tryptamine space especially, often will be doing work with you. They might be doing some kind of surgery with you. They might be pulling a chip out or taking something out, or they might be doing some sort of spiritual surgery with you. So, yeah, does that kind of explain a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. So if my kind of understanding is right, that you're kind of seeing this as some kind of other realm, and that there is a kind of a medium, which we could say is like psychedelics in this case, through which they are kind of ingressing or we are ingressing, but there's a kind of a crossover point, an overlapping between two spaces.
Yeah, there seems to be an etheric dimension which is closely tied into this dimension, like it's actually not separate from this realm. In fact, it's I would say the etheric dimension is very closely, intimately tied into this realm. And it's not like a dimension that you can go into and it has its own world. It seems to be one which exists, corresponds to this world. And the thing is with these entities is, in my view, when you take psychedelics, you take tryptamines, you are able to process a lot more information in your brain. Your brain, I subscribe to the view that DMT is a super neurotransmitter, so that you're actually transmitting a lot more information through your brain, and it seems to open up your third eye, so you're able to see what's already there, whereas the traditional psychiatric view is that what you're seeing under the influence of psychedelics is a hallucination, that it's coming from your brain and you're projecting it from yourself out there somehow, and it's simply a kind of manifestation of your psyche. I won't go into my understanding of that too much because I think it's a bit long-winded, but from my perspective, that doesn't really make any sense, because why does the psyche want to manifest as this vast ecology of intelligence and communication, which it doesn't? The interesting thing about it too is that a lot of it does communicate a sense of non-duality. A lot of it does say, in the ultimate sense, in Lakesh, I am another part of you. But it doesn't say it is you exactly. It doesn't say, I am being projected from your psyche or your brain. There's a definite sense of otherness, or a sense of distinct beingness, which is apart from the human consciousness. So I find it difficult to understand the rationale behind that viewpoint, because in a logical sense, like Occam's razor would say that the simplest, most elegant explanation is the one that is true. And in this instance, it might seem far out from our perspective, but if you think about it in the terms of the consciousness itself, in terms of understanding, and like that consciousness is expansive and there's many facets and aspects and wavelengths and dimensions and colors, and that it makes sense that the sentient life forms within that you can communicate with. It seems very logical to me.
I think my take, I tend to gravitate towards a lot of the kind of the South American shamanism. That's just where I kind of been for a lot of my ayahuasca experiences. And I think the kind of how it was explained to me there is that they seem to see it as like what they refer to as like the spirits are like inhabiting the plant. So it's like you have this consciousness that is within the plant, and then you take this plant in some form, like either ayahuasca or some other kind of medicine. And so then you're literally like ingesting the plant consciousness, and that is what is merging with your consciousness, and thus like kind of giving the feels of, you know, the typical one, like Mother Ayahuasca presents itself on ayahuasca, you know, that like a different kind of spirit presents itself on mescaline. And so this idea of like that consciousness is somehow being distilled down into sort of medicinal form and then being consumed, which is then merging with your own consciousness. And I think I would agree what you're saying around the different kind of colors of the kind of the human landscape, in that, you know, I think we have our day-to-day material experience. I think we have there is a dream, you know, a dream realm, there is an emotional realm, there is a psychological realm, all these different things which are kind of feeding us inputs at different moments when we're kind of receptive to them. And then we have these certain substances which kind of like merge all these things into this new experience. And then kind of along with this kind of like this other consciousness, this plant consciousness containing all this wisdom, something that's been around for a long time in a networked way, and sort of all these things. And that kind of merging is what is giving us that experience. So I think that, to me, if we go to like to the Occam's razor sort of thing, that to me seems more, I don't know, I can package that up more easily than the idea of a kind of a pantheon, or for want of a better word, of different entities that are sort of coming in. Because I mean, it's just my own personal experience. I've never really had much of a difference of these entities. They always seems fairly consistent to me. But do you have the kind of the experience of different things coming through, even within the same substance? Like I get that there's definitely some wiggle room, but there's still like there's always like an ayahuasca theme or a mescaline theme or a mushroom theme.
Right. Well, I think what you're describing, with the ayahuasca spirit merging with the human form, and you know, you having that intimate dialogue with the ayahuasca spirit. I mean, that sounds like a classic experience that you have. And I think a lot of the Amazonian shamanism is very much related to having that deep and powerful connection to that plant spirit. Mm-hmm. But I think what I'm talking about is that, and the other entities that can come through in that space. I mean, ayahuasca, I mean, it really depends on the space that you're in and the facilitator that you're with. And I think in a purely psychological context, when you're having that communion with the ayahuasca, you're able to do that psychological work and that healing work with the ayahuasca. In many respects, you don't want to be distracted by all the hyperdimensional critters out there, you know. And it may well be that the curandero, he or she may well block off any entities from coming into the space. So they really have quite a tight ship very often. When I've drunk many years ago in the Amazon, sometimes the ship is very tight, and you don't necessarily experience much beyond the bubble, as it were. So yeah, I mean, especially with the smoked DMT. But when I first drank, I would drink alone, and I would be drinking Syrian rue and Acacia, and in the early days, I would be going into these different worlds and experiencing hundreds and hundreds of beings in one session. It was just amazing. And I probably should have written down a lot more than I did, because it was so interesting. But, you know, I do remember some of it, but it was overwhelming. And it's not like that for me now, because you know, it was almost like an introduction to the space. It was an introduction to the reality. And I used to say that it took me till the 667th being for me to give up my rational brain and just accept it for what it was, because it was very hard for me just to come to terms with it and to stop protesting, to just let the mind go and accept it for what it was, how it did present itself to me as, how it did appear to be. So yeah, I think, we do have this I think it's quite a Western tendency, this European rational thinking, whereas in many cultures, for example, even in Brazil, where, I remember being in Brazil and talking to people and saying a lot of people in Australia didn't believe in spirits. And they were like, everyone in Brazil believes in spirits. Like, they're very spiritual, religious people, and they've got many different sort of traditions and practices in the ayahuasca world and otherwise related to an understanding of spiritual beings. So, I think, it definitely was for me a matter of just surrendering to what I was experiencing. And these days, when I drink ayahuasca, I don't have that same. I don't not necessarily taken to all these dimensions and shown the same things. It can be, but it's very much different now. Nowadays, I go into battles with these entities and I'm killing them.
Yeah, so I want to come back to that one. We'll circle back around to that, because I think that's a fascinating topic in itself. But I would just on that, what you said, I would agree with. I've had similar experiences, particularly in regard to, say, like vaped DMT versus something like ayahuasca, because I think vaped DMT instantly for me goes very kind of wide out there, cosmic, just incredible narratives, usually like populated by what seems to be millions of beings, but always at a distance. It's never quite as intimate as the kind of the relationship you have with something like where you're having with something like ayahuasca. It seems much more one-on-one. Yeah. But I just wanted to just again to unpack with the thing. So with the entities that you're talking about, because I think with a lot of sort of like psychedelic circle stuff, a lot of the what's being described is that it's the entities that are kind of coming through doing the healing. So it's people often talk about being picked apart by and reassembled by these kind of entities to feel it in the bodies. And with what you're talking around with the kind of what sounds like a more kind of malicious intent, I was just wondering, do you think these things are coming from the same space then? Is the healing and the sort of the maliciousness, is this the same thing, or is this different realms in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, I think also the Western mind has a big difficulty with ascribing, just going into this basic duality of like, well, this is a good one, this is a bad one. But I think it's very simple. I think some of these entities are basically parasites. They're coming to feed off the human energy field. And the ones who are good, they're actually helping. They're healing. They're doing something really powerful. I mean, I've had some quite extraordinary experiences, like these beings coming down and putting swords into my heart, and and then pulling out my heart, my old heart, and then putting a new one back in, and it's just very, very vivid. This is almost 20 years ago I had this one. Very vivid and beautiful and majestic, and something very, what would you call it? Something very solid in how they are. Yeah. So I had many different experiences like that. I mean, I had one midway through last year where I was actually kind of in a battle with various beings, and these two women appeared just right next to me. They like cozied right next to me, like they came up, they didn't hesitate. Whereas the ones who are not good, they're literally creepy. I think there's a reason we have that word. They're creepy because they're hesitant, and they're generally often trying to look good. They're trying to present an impression that they're good or they're positive. And it's, of course they do come towards you and just straight up. But in this instance, these two women, they assumed an intimacy with me. So they were just hanging, they was lying right next to me. And so they already were my friends, Mm-hmm. And so what I saw them proceed to do, I did not understand, but they had these tubes, and it's like they were taking my blood and putting it into a machine and like doing a readout on it. And there's at one point at which we had to clamp one of the tubes, and another one of the tubes, some of the blood came out, and she got some of the blood on my hands, And it's like, I have no idea what this is about or why this is happening, except I'm presuming that this is good for me, that there's some medical checkup. They literally look like nurses. They weren't in uniforms at any time. But I've had other experiences where the beings who are working on you, they do look like nurses in a sense. And you can see that they're doing a job. And you just got to wonder who's paying them. You got to wonder, what do they do after work? Where do they go after work? How does it work from their perspective?
Yeah, I had quite a similar experience recently, although it was more of I was calling like a kind of interdimensional help desk, and there was like a call center who was like sort of dealing with, like, as my brain was like trying to be rebooted and was trying to make sense of things. They're like, okay, yeah, we'll, and these were like sort of like almost like IT technicians, which I guess kind of maps onto me because I work in IT, so that's how I was, perceiving it. But it was there was a group of IT tech nerds kind of like plugging in like Matrix style, like rebooting my brain. But it's interesting with you, because that scenario you just described, even though you were kind of at peace with what was happening, it does have the sound of a kind of a parasitic nature. And I appreciate this is you're talking about the good side here.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Is this not tying into where I'm coming at from here is that I get, I'm sure you probably get them too, a lot of messages from very fundamental religious people telling me that I'm sort of dealing with forces completely beyond my control, and this is all Satan, but they're just tricking you.
I never get any hate mail, Rob. Like, I think people are scared of me. I never get any. Like,
maybe you just do a better job of hiding your email address than I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, does that not? Is there any concerns there that perhaps you are being tricked? That there is a sort of a certain parasitic feel to this.
No, I could tell right away that they were good and they were doing good things, and I tend to find, there is an element, like I said, where they are trying to trick you to get close into you. And the same night I had an experience of a being who I kind of let too closely into my field, and they do really come for you in that space, because I think the other thing that I wanted to mention, and I think is quite clear to a lot of people, say taking ayahuasca or taking psychedelics, is when you are opening up these doorways, these portals to the spirit world. So when you do take psychedelics, you open yourself up, and they can have an easier access to you when you do take the psychedelics. So yeah, no, generally these days, my discernment, that's been the key word. And I think it's more a really gut feeling and having the experience to know which energies are parasitic in nature and which are not. And I find, a lot of people don't have very good discernment, because it needs to be at a gut level, because often you're deceived with what you're seeing with your eyes and what the symbols and identities that are being presented to you. There are many people who are trying to deceive us in our daily life as well. And it's not like the bad people in our lives, quote unquote bad people, they don't they don't come along and say, hey, I'm going to screw you over.
Mm-hmm.
The psychopaths and sociopaths are often very charming, and that's how they get close to you. And to protect yourself from psychopaths and sociopaths, you need to have a gut feeling about people and be able to be aware. And so it works similarly in the metaphysical realm. You need to be aware that that often it's just, you got to watch out for the surfaces which might appear quite beautiful or presentable or seductive on some level, but behind that there are these agendas, and it's not nice.
Yeah, I think it ties back into what you were saying earlier as well, because about this kind of this act of surrender, because that really, I think what a lot of us are trying to do with these experiences, kind of reconnect with ourselves as like human beings. But we've got all these kind of layers that have been stacked on top of, like, and I think you kind of refer to this as kind of like the being too rational, being too in our own heads.
Yeah.
And so when people are having these experiences, they're kind of like not sure how they think about this, not sure how they are supposed to think about this. Is this, am I safe? Is this, and it's kind of very in the heads, where I think a lot of it, you kind of really need to do this kind of, it's a very overused word, but there's no better word, like surrender to. It's like, okay, this is, let's go with this and trust this kind of like gut feeling.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people struggle with that. But I just wanted to come round back to the kind of like the thing on the healing, or the kind of the malicious intent coming from the entities, because I was, my kind of thought on that, or my take on it as I've been sort of working it through, is that because I lean more to the angle that this is something that's going on like internally or like psychologically. So if there is some kind of trauma that I'm suffering and I'm trying to resolve it, that I'm inviting in this kind of like, this consciousness, this plant spirit as a kind of, an advisor, basically to give me a perspective I cannot reach myself. But then I'm the one who is kind of resolving this. This is a typical ayahuasca experience, is that you relive some of these events, and you kind of, through that reliving them, you get to sort of reframe them and sort of resolve them and sort of come to some sort of understanding. But I was wondering, I always had the personal feeling that if that was something that was happening externally, it feels kind of like cheap and sort of unearned. Like if it's just if like the portal opens and the entity appears and just kind of zaps me with healing, then I don't know, that seems to take away the kind of the work, the personal work element, or the kind of the personal agency. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I know there's a famous Jung quote, beware of unearned wisdom. And I don't buy that at all. I think that whenever I've experienced that, you certainly can have these experiences of these beings who can present some powerful healing energies to you. What I find then is that there can often be a healing crisis, because you may have been exposed to a deeper level of purity and a greater awareness, a greater consciousness somehow. And what you will experience then is a purging of that which is not aligned with a higher conscious intent. So that can be quite intense, and it's certainly not easy. I mean, ayahuasca itself is like that. You take the ayahuasca and, you see the geometric patterns, which are the mathematical representation of how life is communicating with the human, and you're experiencing these colors, you're experiencing a purity of information, you're experiencing greater wisdom, and then all of the shit, all of the stupidity, all of the stuff that is not aligned with who you really want to be, you have to let go of that. You have to process that. It's not easy to do that. It's really hard. It's not it's not a walk in the park. So I don't see any of that as unearned. I think it can be a real slog. I mean, I'm always whenever I encounter a really pure, powerful, deep space in myself, make a little note to myself, okay, watch out, because now I'm going to have to let go of a lot that's not aligned with these quote unquote higher principles or awareness,
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know I think it would be great if everyone got zapped by these higher dimensional beings all the time, but it doesn't necessarily work like that. I think that ayahuasca is a slogger. It's a slog for everyone. It's hard work, and I think it's all earned,
Yeah, I think that's maybe my ego speaking. I want to have the credit for all of it, so maybe that's something I need to work on. But I want to, if we're going to circle back round then to something we just touched on, like near the beginning. So when these entities sort of make themselves present, and if for the gut feeling is that these are negative beings, that they're intruding upon your experience. So yeah, if you could sort of go into some of the details on, because you've got methods by which you, I think the language actually is that you kill these things.
Yeah.
So do you want to sort of go into some detail on that for us?
Yeah. Well, there's a technique I call torping that I actually heard about first in year 2000, and a friend, his wife, was playing talks from these walk-ins. I don't know if you've heard about walk-ins before.
I've heard about walkabouts.
No.
What's walking?
So the walk-ins are these beings who they want to exist on Earth as in full memory of who they really are. So what they do is they find someone who's a complete derelict.
So is this someone who's already died? Is this a dead human?
No, this is a higher interdimensional being, right? Okay. So a higher dimensional being wants to come to Earth, incarnate, but they don't want to forget who they are by going through the birth canal and growing up, and they want to have full remembrance because they say they want to teach important information to people on Earth, right? Okay. So what they do, this is what they say they do. They find on the astral level a person whose life is just completely terrible, who's just unemployed, no hope at all, really sick. And they say, look, we'll cut you a sweet deal in the astral if you give us your body, and we'll take over your body. And so Joe, who's complete loser, everyone is like, Joe's just his just life is a mess, is just a waste of space. Suddenly Joe becomes Zarkon from the 87th dimension, starts teaching people spirituality and cosmic consciousness, right? So this is a literal phenomena that happened especially in the 80s. And so all these walk-ins, they converged in Sedona in Arizona and they built a little community, and they gave all these talks. And so my friend was playing these talks, which are very entertaining. You can only buy them. They're very expensive online. The tapes, someone got the rights, and you can buy a lot of these tapes. But anyway, I heard about this technique called boogie busting, where they use sound to break up like fifth dimensional entities they call boogies. And I heard about this, and I didn't think that much of it. But it was only in probably 2013 that I had an experience with a big black spider come towards me. And I was like, oh, okay, this is a bit, what am I going to do? And the sound just came out of me, like the boogie busting sound. It just went, and I just kept doing it. And so the big spider was like a few feet across. It just died, melted in front of me, and it was very satisfying. So that was my first experience of making this sound. And then I think it took me maybe 3 years to give it a name, because it just did. It was just that sound that I made. And I started calling it torping. And then over the years, I've got better and better at it. And now I can do machine gun torping, which is like this. Which means that I can kill anything, really. And back in the early days when I couldn't do that, I remember one distinct experience in Norway where I was completely overcome. And, it's like you become temporarily possessed. You get taken, you become insane, and you feel like you're going to die. And you have all these thoughts which are not your own, and you feel like you're being bullied from within. And it's absolutely horrible. So that's what happened when that's what led me to develop machine gun torping. But actually, I had to develop sopla, which is this blowing technique. I didn't develop it. It's what they've been doing in the Amazon for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's this that blowing that they do. And you might hear people in ayahuasca groups trying to be really cool. They're like, as if it's like a sort of, a sonic accessory. But actually what you're doing then is blowing the entities, and they don't like that. And you can kill them by doing that, but generally you're pushing them away. And so sopla works really well.
I'm certainly familiar with the sopla, and it's sort of very common for shamans to do. I think they even do it over like the bottles of ayahuasca to sort of like to clear anything away from the bottles themselves, and then I've been in ceremonies where they kind of come and do it over your head to sort of like clear, particularly if someone's having a very challenging experience. But it's just because those are kind of words you do. Would you say that what happens then, like if you hadn't kind of pushed back this spider entity, and is this what you would kind of commonly associate with demonic possession? Then is that what you think is going on there? That one of these beings is taking over, and then that's what's when people are sort of writhing around and people are saying I'm possessed. Is that what you think's going on there?
Well, I tell you what. Just after I was on TV, I was sent video. People are reaching out to me because they're really desperate, and I got sent videos of this woman who's got this. I never heard of it, called a movement disorder. I didn't even know it exists. She cannot stop moving. Her whole body is contorting all the time, and she can't sleep at all. Like she sleeps an hour a night, maybe. And I was like, wow, okay, this is classic possession of some kind. And I think the more understanding I have, I think that I've been thinking recently that perhaps chronic fatigue syndrome is a kind of entity possession. People might have a pain like chronic cluster headaches, I consider to be entity attachments, and the more I understand about what kind of suffering people are going through in their lives, I see that people are getting attacked by these entities.
How does that end? Because I'm taking not all these people are taking psychedelics then. So no. The woman who had the movement disorder, she's never taken psychedelics. So what's the entry point then for her? Like,
point for her was when she was in the mental hospital. She told me, and I think mental hospitals are places where you are encountering a lot of these, a lot of what we call mental illness. Is I would call very much often is entity attacks or entity attachments. In Brazil, they have the Spiritus Mental Church, and they have dozens of mental hospitals where before you even enter the hospital, the nurses and psychiatrists will practice spirit depossession upon you so they can begin to treat you, which is so far advanced of anything we're doing in the West, you know. But I think that really goes to show, yeah, sure, there are a lot of people out there who have this understanding. It's just that our overall society is not often wanting or willing to understand. And I'd say a lot of that is because of the influence of the entities themselves. It's like, you know, Satan doesn't want us to realize that he exists, you know.
Well, there was another point you mentioned in that kind of post you made where you're talking around that, well, first of all, that people aren't talking about the kind of stuff we're talking about here. But also, I think you sort of suggested that there are people who are deliberately not talking about it, even despite, in your opinion, having knowledge of it. And I think that, you know, the term used here was like kind of like spiritual bypassing, or whereby people are only wanting to talk about the light stuff, you know, the sort of the happy rainbows and unicorns.
Oh, yes. I think I was talking about Barbara Ann Brennan.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Have you come across her books at all?
No, I've not. I only, from the reference, I went and briefly looked her up to see who she was, but no, I've not much experience with her personally. But feel free if you want to give some.
I came across her books when I was 18. They were written in the late 80s and 1993. They're actually spiritual healing guidebooks, and they're absolutely fascinating because what you're reading is designed to be a textbook for spiritual healers. So when I was 18 and I first came across these books, it's just, for me, it's utter science fiction. But my viewpoint is like, how could she be making this up? It doesn't make any sense, you know. It was very difficult for me to comprehend. But absolutely astounding books, Light Emerging and Hands of Light. She was a NASA scientist who became a spiritual healer. So she very much tried to maintain a scientific viewpoint, and she wanted to maintain credibility, and so that her work, the spiritual healing work, was integrated within American society. And in that case, then it's very difficult to begin to mention the quote-unquote dark side. So she recently wrote another book called, I think it's called Core Light Healing, where she begins to admit, hey, look, there is actually a dark side. And because previously I think she was wanting, you know, this is the whole new age mentality, that it's all love, light and rainbows and, you know, farting unicorns, and there's no dark side. It's all good, right? But that attitude of it's all good and it's all rainbows and all unicorns, that's spiritually, it's a very naive position that could really lead you into, you know, becoming like Bambi's mum. And it's not a healthy position to have. We've got to have awareness of what's actually happening, and, you know, we don't even have a very good language. We call it dark, you know. It's like not really dark, it's more like horrific, you know.
But are you of the opinion that there are other people out there? Because I think there was a number of people you mentioned in this post. Because I think the original post itself was commenting on a panel that had happened.
Oh yeah, right, yep.
And so do you? I'm just wondering, like, because obviously clearly there's a skeptical point of view where there's people that just say, crazy person, shut up, you know. But then I think what you were suggesting is that there's actually more of a kind of like, look, we know about this, but we're not going to talk about this, which I think is probably what comes into the person just mentioned.
Yes. Well,
do you think there's more of this, like, out there?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of this. I think Barbara Ann Brennan, she said in an article in New Age Journal, of all places, in the 80s, I think, she said she didn't want to mention a lot of things because she didn't want to scare people, you know. And I think also it's just so far beyond the typical person's understanding. We don't have frameworks within the West for understanding this sort of thing. But I think, you know, in many other cultures, they do, or at least the shaman in the culture understands how to deal with and address and communicate and dialogue with these things. But in the West, we only have like schlocky movies like Ghostbusters and horror movies and so on. But I think it's interesting, you know, it's like this woman with this movement disorder. She was in utterly hell. She's utterly
I can
hell,
imagine, yeah.
you know. And I had an experience myself where I came down with an attack of cluster headaches when I was in a run. And I understood that as a spiritual attack. And it took me a few weeks to be able to clear it. And if I didn't know how to clear it, and I myself, even though knowing what I know and I saw it happen, I myself was so captured by the overall experience, inoculated into ignorance, that I didn't even know it was happening. I had to just sit down and feel the pain enough to wake myself up. You know, it's like they call cluster headaches suicide headaches. You're just running around like Homer Simpson crashing into walls. It's absolutely horrific. And what you're actually experiencing is kind of being eaten from within inside by these entities. And that's what it feels like too. It's absolutely horrific. And I think that there's a lot going on within our society that I would hope, in my understanding, that things that we don't understand in our present day, serious medical conditions like cluster headaches, I think very often maybe these entity attacks, judgments, and these attacks, because I was able to clear them after a few weeks, and I've been able to help other people with, you know, various conditions, but not many, because it's not like people come forward to me and say, hey, I need help with entity attachments, you know, because there's no understanding or awareness of it, you know.
Yeah, and I think there's also the kind of, I think with talking about psychedelics, or at least the experience of psychedelics at even a fairly low level, there's still, I think, a kind of a stigma around. It sounds crazy, you know, if you went into work, say, one day and someone said, you know, what did you do last night? And you described a psychedelic event, they would be like, get security on the phone, get this guy out of here.
Exactly. Well, that's the other thing. That's the other thing, Rob. As soon as you start talking about entities, beings, it's literally a cultural taboo in our society. You are literally considered crazy within our society. It's like you're breaking the fourth wall that's not supposed to be broken, and the little alarm bells are going off in your head in a way when you start talking about this, because it's like we're not supposed to look beyond, you know, a certain range. It's like the movie They Live. Have you seen that movie?
I have seen that many times, yeah.
It's a literal documentary. And it's when the guy puts on the glasses. It's like, and then he sees the aliens, but the aliens see that he's seeing them. And that's when the trouble happens. And I think that's very metaphorical, because I think that, you know, hey, if you're one of these people out there who are not seeing entities, you got to ask yourself, do you really want to put on those glasses?
Well, yeah, because that's it. Once it's kind of revealed to you, and I think even within that movie, well, I think once he starts putting the glasses on, he starts getting like headaches, doesn't he, or nosebleeds or something. It's having just the knowledge is having a kind of a toll on him. So yeah, it's got a lot of layers to it, that movie. But it's interesting with the kind of particularly with the kind of the medical condition stuff talk about, just for my own circumstance, when I have epilepsy. So when you're talking about the kind of the cluster headaches and the feeling of, you know, something having control over your body, which is going to result in something unpleasant. I get that sort of before completely like losing control of my body in a horrific sort of way. But I think I would find it easier, or at least the way I rationalize it, is that as being a kind of a manifestation of trauma rather than being a sort of something that's kind of possessing me at that spot. But I think, but it's kind of interesting that kind of language of possession, because, you know, a lot of time previously there was a supernatural element attached to something around like epilepsy. It was either seen as like something divine, like within the oracle, like someone would have consciousness, or a sign of demonic possession.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I would tend to lean towards that. That's something internal that I'm kind of unresolving rather than an external attack. But again, that's just kind of how I've rationalized it.
That's really interesting. I never actually thought about epilepsy as being something that could be an entity attack. I have seen epileptics have a fit. And it's quite interesting that the shaking that epileptics go into can be quite violent. And you know what it reminds me of as well, that kind of shaking, it reminds me of the kind of Pentecostal shaking that they go into. And also people do that in psychedelics. Like, it can be good. The shaking that they go into can be very positive, and there can be a lot of healing in it. But I understand with epileptics, it can be incredibly violent. I'm not saying epilepsy is that, because I haven't really thought about, but I would be open to the idea that there could be some relationship here, and there's definitely something that we don't understand, because I don't think there is much understanding about what it is and how its cause is there.
Yeah, it is a funny one, because some people report almost like psychedelic euphoria before having more of these seizures. And certainly for myself, when I come around, even though first of all, I'm not trying to big up epilepsy. It's horrible. It's one of the worst experiences you can have. But when you come around from that experience, even though you're in a lot of pain and soreness because it is extremely violent, there is a feeling of a mental reset. And I believe from a medical perspective, that is what is literally happening. There is a kind of a mental rebooting as all this kind of extra activity dissipates. So yeah, it's kind of it's interesting. But just as I think we just went down a side road there. Just to kind of come back to the kind of the spiritual bypassing sort of, or toxic positivity aspect of it. Do you think this is something, because and this is something I think we've agreed on previous topics, without going into too much details or naming any names, but there does seem to be a need within, and I think you highlighted it, particularly in Western culture, particularly in the US culture, I would say probably more than Europe, in that the need for psychedelics to be safe. It's got to be like safe. And I think the meaning of safe has been kind of bastardized somewhat because I would kind of interpret it as like you need to be in a safe place, a place where you're not going to be disturbed, a place where what needs to happen can happen.
Yeah,
that's how I define safe. But then I think this has been turned into kind of like, no, the actual experience itself needs to be safe. Like if it's going wrong, like that's. Get the trip killers out. Get the soft toys. Get the trip killers. Like, sort of don't go through it. And I think it's misfiring somewhat. I think that what safe means and what it's like, the kind of like the light and the fluffy. I'm just wondering what your take was on that.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things to unpack there. I think that when you're talking about highly traumatized people and when they're reliving their trauma, for example, like the guy who bit my arm, I was wearing 3 layers of clothes, and weeks later, I still have puncture wounds, you can see. He just bit down as hard as he could. So it wasn't really that safe for me, but at the time. But basically, I think, psychedelics can bring up such powerful material, and people can bring up, demonic energies as well. I've seen that even with MDMA. I just did a podcast with a friend of mine who is an exorcist. And so he actually...
An exorcist is in like the movie?
Yes.
Oh, okay, just checking.
He removes entities from people. and people get great alleviation from whatever's ailing them from having these energies removed from them. And I don't think that many people are seriously possessed, but a lot of people have these issues, I would say. But yeah, getting back to your question about safe, I don't know. I think that psychedelics are so powerful, and like I said, they can open up all these doorways and gateways. And what I'm really concerned about in this kind of medicalized model, just as there's this big meeting of psychedelic people in Davos in Switzerland at the moment, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm just concerned that about what I would consider this kind of Western arrogance. We don't really understand psychedelics and how they work and what they do. The mainstream psychiatric perspective considers hallucinations, where someone like myself considers what happens is valid information, and valid communication, and valid experiences, which is why they're so powerful. But I think, going back to what I was saying, what I'm concerned about in this so-called psychedelic renaissance is as more and more people are accessing psychedelics, more and more people are opening up these doorways to all these entities, and I can see a lot of potential carnage. I can see a lot of potential difficulty. I can see, some things, some potential sort of sabotage to occur there, whereby you are having, unusual phenomena like possession and extremely unusual crazy behavior and cultish-like behavior and tendencies. And I'm seeing this is the biggest danger to the psychedelic renaissance right now, and I've experienced it in the underground. I think the psychedelic underground is very messy at times, and there is a lot of this cultish behavior. There's a lot of, people who are really not in their right mind, and it's all very concerning to sort of watch the convergence of the above ground mainstream with the underground.
Have you got any sort of thoughts on how to combat that? 'Cause, I mean, I guess just to sort of be like devil's advocate, like somebody, you yourself are your own sort of part of that underground community, and then we've got, people. I mean, there's certainly people I've talked about on this channel who I think are, they've got their own sort of underground community, and I think what they're doing is very strange and sort of worth calling out and challenging some of their ideas. But we are in it is an underground thing, and I would agree with what you're saying around it becoming, if it's the right word, clinicalized, or just completely moving it into the clinical space. I don't think that's
it's not
an alternative, or any ideas?
Well, at the moment, I'm basically, previously I'd been going, look, I'm a pioneer species. I'm just going to run for the hills, and you guys can figure this out because it's not my business. It's like, okay, I'm done. Now I'm realizing I might have some sort of obligation to kind of steer and help navigate people. So what I'm thinking about doing is really helping to train people to understand these dimensions we're talking about, and facilitators, people who are conducting scientific research, and really just try and establish and inform people about the territory and the nature of the space, and how they can create a safe space. Because I think, ultimately, in terms of the ayahuasca world, I remember when I first started facilitating groups, people would say, oh, I would only do that with the shaman. I never do that with the white guy, because the shaman is the one who's going to keep you safe from where the wild things are, creatures, So yeah, I think in Australia over the last decade or so, we've had a lot of conversations, and there's been conferences about, okay, what is it to create safe space, and how do we deal with these entities? So there's a bit of a conversation in Australia going on that's quite evolved, whereas that conversation hasn't seemed to have hit the US as much. I think it's maybe very much an underground conversation. But definitely, I would say, yeah, what we all need to be focused on collectively is, how do we ensure, not just mental and ethical hygiene, but psychic, emotional, spiritual hygiene as well, so that there is like the right kind of clarity and focus intent in this work. Because I think, the big concern for me is there's a lot of arrogance in this kind of psychological theatric model, which is really, it's like, we found these really powerful tools, and all right, now let's get them to work and let's do some work, but it's like, in terms of that paradigm, I'd say, hey guys, you might want to actually spend some time with people from indigenous cultures and understand their worldview and how they're working with it, which I have done, not to a great degree, but I have done it. And I think this medicalized model is often just completely discount. The shaman's nowhere to be seen. It's like, that guy, no, he's deluded, he's tripping. That's just, we've moved on from that. He's a pre-rational creature from a more primitive understanding of reality, That.
Yeah, the thing I found with the kind of the medical model, I was actually at a psychedelic conference in Switzerland a couple of weeks ago, and this was a lot of like research students and stuff talking about the kind of the trials they're doing around things like MDMA and DMT and stuff. It was fascinating to hear them talk about it. But the thing which even they identified is like, this cannot scale. If you can get 25 plus people in a room, as long as you've got adequate facilitators, and you can treat 25 people. If you're going to have one person in a soft touch, everything soft, nerfed bedroom with sort of, with a doctor on hand and a nurse on hand, that's only going to be available for the ultra rich, because it's just it just doesn't, it's not going to create the kind of the group change through it, the kind of the human collective. So I think we've got to get back somehow to this kind of community model of psychedelics, like what they have in South America. And I think that's where I think Australia's kind of like taking the lead, because from what I gather, you guys have like really sort of gone into your way to like find like plants, your own plants that work within sort of Australia, which is sort of creating sort of analogs of doing that. Whereas I think, and not to wail on any of our US viewers, but a lot of there is just kind of like being imported. It's like importing a chunk of culture and perhaps missing the point somewhere. Well,
I think I don't know if you know Frederica Merkel Fischer. She's based in Zurich. So she's based in Zurich. She's a German woman, and
I think she got in a bit of trouble recently.
She did, not recently, but some years ago she did get busted. And she said she only does groups with people because no one would be able to afford the one-on-one work. It's just too expensive. I think the only way to scale it effectively is the group work. I mean, the one-on-one work, it can be done, but it's much more cost effective, much more scalable, because we simply don't have enough people to have two therapists giving one person MDMA. I mean, it's going to be very expensive any way you swing it. So definitely, I suppose what I'm working with is how the models that we use. How do we create new models? And on that front, one of the other things I think is interesting is you just can't do this work every day. You can't clock in at 9 a.m. and see 3 clients and give them psychedelics, one in each room, and you would burn out it's too intense.
The psychological burdens of people unloading that stuff would be.
It's too much. I think in terms of ayahuasca facilitation, I mean, have done groups every week for a period of time, but you are completely cooked after a period of time doing that. It is intense. I would say for most facilitators do once a month, once every 2 weeks. You just can't do much more than that without kind of frying yourself. It's too intense in a way that after I facilitate a group, it's like I'm recovering from a minor bicycle accident. You feel mangled up inside, It's very intense.
There's something that comes from the group collective, though, isn't there? I think there is like a kind of a group healing that goes on. Or just being in proximity to other people, and even hearing other people work through their problems, it gives you a sort of chance to reframe some of your things. I think this is why these kind of like these group sharing sessions are kind of so useful after a psychedelic, because often I hear somebody's perspective on their experience, and it gives me a chance to reframe my own experience. So I think to lose all this it'll be interesting to see how things develop within the clinical space, but I'm hoping we get back to this more community thing. I'm conscious of your time, Julian, so I've got one more thing.
It's 9:20 here. The night is young.
Well, I wanted to, with all the things that we talked about, is this across the board? Do you think we've mentioned a few times, we've talked about DMT, we've talked about ayahuasca, it's kind of analogs. What about somebody who's watching this, who's talking about taking like LSD at a music festival? Like, is this, are they opening the same doors in your opinion? Or is there first, I guess, let me put this into two parts. Are all psychedelic substances equal in this regard? Or is it something like, are there ones which are more likely, which are opening the door, and ones which could be taken purely recreational? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting. We talk about LSD and the phenomena of bad trips, and I think that very often a bad trip is when there is some kind of temporary entity possession that happens, because what is experienced is in like the bad trip is often it's inexplicable, and I don't necessarily see that it's always healing or positive, or it's just a purging of negative psychological material. I'd say very often the bad trip is an entity attack, and the last time I took LSD was in Tanzania, and I took 900 micrograms with a solid dose of peyote.
Okay, you weren't messing around.
No, there's no reason. It was I thought it was 600, but my friend is like, no, the 6 drops at 150 mics, not 100 mics. So, and I took it with 3 little peyote bowls as well. So it was very strong, and I started to go into the battles that I normally go into. And because the LSD is a little bit slow, unlike the tryptamines, which are quite fast, I was overcome and I wasn't able to defend myself properly. And so I effectively became possessed and went into very bad trip. The rest of the session, I thought I was going to die. Everything just goes really dark, and there's all these crazy thoughts, and I thought I was never going to come back out of it. And that's, I think, when I had that experience, I realized that a lot of what are called bad trips are very often some kind of temporary possession, and I think some of these possessions can be permanent. People can take LSD and not come back.
See, for myself, because I've never really, maybe this is just because I've not done enough of a deep enough dose with LSD, but for me, it's always felt like there was a kind of, Oh, sorry, that was just my doorbell. Just ignore that. It always felt like there was some kind of division between something like LSD, which to me has more of a, I don't know, a sort of, for want of a better term, artificial feel to it. It's just a different. I don't quite get the same being communicated with from LSD as I do from something like sort of like mushrooms, something like that. But it's interesting that because typically when a lot of people who I've seen having like bad trips on LSD are usually ones who are on fairly low doses, and I tend to find this person myself with something like ayahuasca. Like if I sort of say lose my courage a bit and take a small cup, I'm more likely because you're much more then in your own head kind of thing. Whereas if you take the larger dose, then you just kind of pulled along for the narrative ride. Yeah. So yeah, I was just, I don't know, I'd never had that same feel with something like LSD, and I think you actually mentioned this in your post. But you think these things are kind of more or less equal, so whether it's like LSD or mescaline or DMT, the same possibilities of encountering these entities are there.
Oh yeah, the same possibility. Probably less so with mescaline, because people aren't taking the higher doses. But I think all psychedelics, they do open up these, and they do lower your defenses to these entities, and and that's the other thing. Like, a lot of people are not going to experience any entities at all. Some people are not going to experience entities, but they're all going to be good entities, and that's great. If you're one of those people, like, great. That's not how it's been for me.
Do you think, because when we talk around entities, because I think you mentioned this at the beginning, like when you were kind of getting into it, there wasn't really talk of, machine elves, and I personally hate the phrase machine elves. But I think since the kind of the birth of YouTube and the availability of people like Terence McKenna talking about these things, and that's kind of now been adopted into the language, and there's perhaps colouring what people are coming to expect from these things, because they're now being sort of told, machine elves. So that's what they see. But I think, even the phrase that's what they see, I would kind of like, I don't tend to think of these things as necessarily as a purely visual phenomenon. I think this ties into what you're saying around hallucination. I think there's more to it than that. You can have like an emotional entity, or a sort of like a cycle. It's not necessarily a visual thing that presents itself in front of you.
No. I think there's a definite feeling. I think, the sense of the third eye, the entities, you feel them as much as you see them, and you feel the influence of their thoughts. So where I've come to in my life is experiencing the entities in my daily life now. So I can see them not as clearly as when on psychedelics, but I will see them quite regularly in my life. So I see them all around us.
Is this where someone will be telling you, you're doing too many drugs, Julian, this is, you need to...
Well, there's one, I remember one time I was walking down Oxford Street in London, and I was, I don't know if you've had this feeling when you go out shopping and you kind of feel drained and a bit tired and not so good. And I remember I had a lot going shopping with my mum, and it was a really draining experience. And I had this feeling, and it felt really yucky. And I was looking in Oxford Street, and I saw these octopuses in the middle of Oxford Street with their long, like, tendrils, which was stinging the people and then draining their energy as they were walking by. And so I did Sopla on them, like, and I immediately, that feeling, that drained kind of yucky, being stung feeling left me entirely, So for me, these sorts of experiences are completely normal. I'll have these experiences. I might have an entity I might start to have a little bit of a headache, and I'll be like, oh, what's that? All right, there's some sort of entity who's got his little fucking like proboscis or whatever it is inside my head, and I will torp him and kill him, and my headache will go away.
Mm-hmm. So from your sort of day-to-day episode, these things are just around everybody constantly, and so it's more that when we're taking psychedelics, we're sort of increasing that.
That's right.
Increasing their ability to control us, I guess.
Well, yeah, this is why I mean, some of us are kind of going, why are the elite of this world so interested in psychedelics? And it's like, if you sort of think of it from that perspective, you're thinking in like the evil headquarters of the entities. They're like, right, we're going to use these psychedelics to assert our dominance and control over the species even more than we have. So, yeah, I mean, who knows? There certainly could be that. There could be an aspect of that, because you certainly see they're even in Australia in the media, I'm like, why are they so keen on psychedelics? It's suddenly gone from bad, don't touch them, they're drugs, to like, hey, these are really good. Everyone should consider taking psychedelics. And now they're in Davos, and the elite of our society, like really interested now. So you really got to wonder about the agenda of the psychedelic renaissance, and be quite skeptical, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be like sort of the devil's advocate, it could be, I mean, it genuinely could be that there's people just recognizing that these things are just much more effective than some of the pharmaceutical solutions. It could be that, maybe the pharmaceutical industries are seeing a way to, make money out of these things. That's, you can usually find a driving force behind these. I'm not so sure that it doesn't seem to me like, because I mean, there's a lot of talk around the kind of like the conspiracy angle of like big pharma is trying to keep people suppressed by keeping them on these things. So it doesn't make sense to me that there's a kind of a model that people could make the same kind of money out of psychedelics that they could make out of certain like things like opioids or things like that, things which are numbing people down. So maybe it is just like, I don't know, maybe there's people just recognizing you can be a more productive worker drone if you're happy and healthy. I don't know. I mean, there could be so many levels to it.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a bit skeptical about how people are actually going to make money out of psychedelics unless they're creating new compounds. I mean, I don't know if there's a great deal of money to be made just manufacturing MDMA for psychotherapeutic functions. I would say the real money to be made is in creating these kind of high-end retreat centers, where I certainly know there are some people who've got their eye on that market,
Well, that's something, I mean, yeah, let's get your take on that, because I've noticed, certainly since I've, been, partaking in sort of retreats, the prices have shifted fairly dramatically from when I was first looking at going on to one of these things, where I would say like what was considered like the elite, like the upper luxury retreats were kind of like $2,000 or something for a week, and I was like, oh, that's a lot. To now where I'm seeing like $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 retreats, and it's almost like there's a gentrification going on there, where sort of luxury retreats are being built. And sort of catering, with swimming pools and sort of 5-star chefs being brought in and all this stuff. And my thought was like who are these for? Because this is, if the whole talk around the psychedelic renaissance is, let's have this group healing, let's bring these things into the mainstream and let's have a group healing, and that psychedelic retreats are good, but it's going to cost you 10 grand, or it's going to cost you 6 grand. And I was kind of, there's a mismatch here going on. So I mean, I've just to go on a tangent, because I actually put out a video last week around some of this stuff, because one of the things I've been seeing popping up a lot is other ways of monetizing the psychedelic renaissance. the classic one is there's a lot of online courses that are appearing around.
Oh, yep.
I'll teach you this, or here's how I'll teach you how to integrate for $500 or something. I'll teach you how to integrate your experiences, or I will teach you even better. Like I will teach you how to become an integration coach or something like that. And, these like $1,000 courses.
Yeah.
So that was something I seen popping up. I was like, oh, this kind of leaves a little bit of a bad taste in my stomach. But yeah, I mean, what's your own thought? I mean, like for things like retreats or this passing on knowledge, because I guess there's one part of, I don't begrudge people making a living, particularly if someone's built a retreat center, and I go to retreat centers, I believe in retreat centers, but I think there's a point where you're taking the piss with these things. What do you think?
I definitely find the idea that you're creating a kind of luxury retreat for ayahuasca a little bit off-putting, because if you're doing it right, the experience is like the opposite of luxury. It's like going to a Spartan boot camp and being kind of like, shouted at and screamed at and being told to fucking get your shit together. You're not being, treated with silk gloves at all. It's actually quite intense. And so I'm a little bit skeptical about these sort of luxury retreats. But in terms of pricing, I think that possibly what's been happening is demand has been increasing, and people who are actually really good at this, which there's not that many, I'd say it's possibly like 10% at the most, are really quite good at this. And it's like mechanics. Yeah. Good luck trying to find a good mechanic. I mean, it's hard. It's like trying to find a good plumber, a good psychologist. I mean, I know a GP. He doesn't know any good GPs. He doesn't know any good doctors, and he is a GP. So it's like that, trying to, I do this. I don't know many people who are very good at it. So I think the people who are good at it, maybe they have a right to charge an exorbitant amount of money. I just increase I increase my prices, like I doubled them and a little bit more, because I just can't handle the amount of people coming to me, and I want to work with smaller, more intimate spaces, and I want to improve the way I do this. And I think, people in some sense, they should really put the money forward to have to do this. Like talking about mechanics, my car is being fixed at the moment, and it's going to cost a lot of money to get it fixed. And it's not a small job. And I consider ayahuasca's like, maybe it should cost as much as it costs to have like a lot of decent work done on your car, and maybe that's a good thing, that it shouldn't just be something you do every weekend just for shits and giggles. You really should take it seriously.
Yeah, so, I think I saw something you'd written recently where you're saying something like you were going to introduce a model of bringing, like, for every X number of places you would have sort of 2 free places or something like that. Right. Do you think that's like, is that something you're implementing or?
Yeah, I'm implementing that because it already, with my old prices, students and single mothers and a lot of people just can't afford it, And it's not that, just people who run their own businesses or whatever. It should be, people who are doctors and dentists and whatever should be doing this. And, it should be open to people who sincerely want to do this. And so I think that is something that should be implemented in this work, because it is, if it's done right, I think, it's going to cost a lot or a fair amount of money. It's already a fair amount of money most places in the world. And some people just can't afford drinking ayahuasca. So, I've made this thread, which really took off on Facebook. And a lot of other facilitators said, hey, look, I already do this. And I think it's a great idea that facilitators really pay it forward And maybe it can be that some people who can pay it forward for other people who, they pay for people who maybe can't afford it. So I haven't quite implemented it myself, but I think that it's, with such powerful medicine, it's not that the government in Switzerland or Australia is presently paying for this. It's not presently paying for people's mental health, and it's not accessible for everyone. And I think that it should be, really.
Yeah, I saw there was some interesting comments in that thread regarding sort of then people's commitment to what is happening because they haven't paid. And I think it was a valid point in that, like, if someone gets something for free, are they as invested in it then as if they, say, had scrimped and saved? And it's a very fuzzy line, that, for me. On the one hand, I think the kind of the pay it forward kind of method, for want of a better word, is like at least the way it should be. But on the other hand, there is something around how much someone is committed to this rather than them just turning up for it. And I suppose that comes then to does it then become a kind of task to triage these people and to vet them, which in itself then becomes who needs it most kind of thing. It seems like it can get quite tricky there. Is that something you've come up against, or?
I haven't got there yet. I think for me, the whole thing is tricky and has been for a long time. So the tricky just keeps going.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to have to wrap it up next. My kids are telling me that they need to come and get their lunch, and as I mentioned, this isn't a real camper van. The kitchen's just back there, so I think it's a good place to run. Just before we go, I mean, first of all, mate, again, thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Julian. Is there any way you want to point people towards if they want to find out more about your stuff or how to work with you?
Just my website, julianpalmerism.com, and I've got workshops email list, I've got a writing email list, and I've got a podcast as well, Revelations with Julian Palmer. That's on every podcast app. So bring out one every month or so. That's awesome. About it.
Yeah, well, I'll leave a link in the description below. Again, awesome to talk to you, and keep doing what you're doing, mate. And I'll look forward to reading more of your stuff online.
Likewise, thanks for the chat, Rob. It's been really good.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, mate. All right, take care, Julian.
Bye-bye.